Hi, I'm Calendar, and this here is my game, codenamed Unknown. Although that's kind of not really what it is anymore, but I'll get to that. 4 years ago I started developing my dream game and I always wanted to do a devlog series. However, as you can see, this is my first video on the project, 4 years into development. Which is why this devlog is going to be a little bit different. You see, I didn't exactly record a lot of footage of the development in those past few years. All I have are some screenshots of beautiful bugs and occasional successes. However, one thing I do have is this beautiful Git repository, which, through the power of version control, allows me to go all the way back in history. To right here. The first ever commit from December the 28th of 2020. And here we now are, in the exact state of the project from more than 4 years ago. As you can probably tell, I decided to use Unity for this project, since I already had some experience with that engine and also already created an entire game with it. That's a topic for another video though. Let's now jump right into this project's beginnings and straight up hit play. And there we are. What a magnificent plane we're looking at, isn't it? Do not be fooled though, there is more to it. As you can see, once I move this dummy player position over just a little bit. So there are multiple planes. Amazing. Well, yes and no. What you're looking at is the partitioning of the world into small chunks that can be loaded in and out depending on the player's position, effectively paving the way for an infinitely large world within the limited resources of a computer. Impressive, isn't it? What do you mean, like every YouTuber game dev made this? Well, even so, it was somehow enough to convince my friend David to join in on the project. So from there on, we both worked on separate parts of the game, with me continuing with the world chunk system and David taking on the challenge of creating the world actually placed in those chunks. We roughly knew that we wanted to go for a low poly landscape like this, which means that we needed a way to generate that. First we got started with some meshes, which went quite well, so we ambitiously ramped up to 2 full chunks, which, yeah, that doesn't look right. Not long after though, we already had something going that somewhat assembled terrain. Following that success, we somehow went 3 steps backwards before leaping ahead again by generating this much smoother terrain. There was, however, still one big, very obvious problem we had to deal with. Can you make it out? Yep, I'm talking about these ugly gaps. Why are they even here? To figure that out, we need to take a look behind these meshes. In the background, the world consists entirely of voxels, so we have this grid where every single voxel can be a different material. Let's now say we have some stone here and some air over here. Since the stone is solid and the air is not, we know that we need to place meshes between the two like this. This process has to be limited to a per chunk basis, and that's exactly where the problem arises. With another chunk next to our example here, we have all the voxels we need. But since this chunk can also only create the meshes based on its own voxels, we end up with this gap between the chunks. To solve this, I implemented a delay to the generation of the meshes, where every chunk waits until the chunks bordering it in the positive directions are loaded in, so they can access these additional voxels to generate their mesh, resulting in a slightly larger mesh covering up the gaps. To get a better look at the result, I ramped up the render distance a little bit too ambitiously to an apparently lunatic 7 chunks. Fascinated and doubtful, I watched as our amazing code worked a solid 45 minutes while slowly filling up my RAM, seemingly not achieving anything else whatsoever. It was like a car accident, I just couldn't take my eyes off the RAM number. Before it could finish though, I ended up killing it anyways. So yeah, I guess there might be a few more big, very obvious problems that needed addressing. Obviously, we started by making the terrain orange. We also set up a somewhat proper player with controls for testing and put some serious effort into optimizing the chunk loading. It still sucks, but a little less so. Just one more day in the future, or rather one less day in the past, I guess. Either way, at that point the performance improvements are pretty striking. We're looking at a view distance of 12 chunks here with majorly improved freeze frames. It's still stuttery, but I'd call it almost playable. Maybe. Also, as you probably have noticed, we got some actual world generation going now. And that with a pretty neat system even. In the world settings we have this generation parameter here that dictates how every little detail is generated. And of course I had some fun playing with that. We then added some more biomes, but that didn't really help with our performance problem that much. There was only one logical conclusion at that point. Considering that it was practically impossible to further improve the performance directly, definitely we didn't just lack the experience and skills for that, our conclusion was that our game clearly needed multi-threading. Nothing that could possibly go wrong with that. Okay, so a few very minor things might have come up. Once we got all that ironed out though, the result ended up surprisingly good even. Now we could finally have a large render distance without any concerns about the performance. Oh god, never mind. We might still have a minor memory issue here. We also reached a point in the timeline here where progress for the first time significantly slowed down. The multi-threading itself was functional on January 3rd, just 7 days after all this even started, which is pretty crazy thinking back. This project, especially in the beginning, really was pure crunch mode, and I totally loved it. Me and David were 110% into this and literally worked from early in the morning till deep into the night. That enthusiasm started to wear down a little though, now that we had to actually make all the fun things we implemented work properly. A necessary part of any project and a challenge that unfortunately a lot of projects get stuck on forever. Ask me how I know. We did manage to push on though, continuing to improve the performance over the next couple of days until... Yep, winter holidays were over and college didn't exactly help with motivation. All of a sudden the first drop in motivation didn't look all that bad. Soon after I was also back on my own on this project, still making occasional progress here and there. I added some props to the world generation, mostly without issues, and then decided to get rid of them again. Also I did some work on the biome blending and of course I further optimized the chunk loading, including the horrific memory usage. Although this one specific optimization, that kinda sucks, let's revert that. However, now that I think about it, it wasn't so bad after all. Never mind, it sucks. This time for real though. Yeah, I must admit, these commits really aren't of very high quality. Anyways, let's continue. One of the more impactful performance improvements I managed to get from increasing the chunk size. I upped that from 16 to 32, so every chunk now has 32 by 32 by 32 voxels. At the first moment this might sound counterintuitive. After all, we're increasing the amount of voxels every single chunk has to save in memory, load in and out, create its mesh from and so on. It severely helped with all the per chunk stuff though, since we now only need 1/8 of the chunks for the same render distance, lifting a huge load from all the systems managing and working with the chunks, which allowed me to add something that I know I wanted to add for a while already. Low resolution chunks. These chunks only store a fraction of the voxels and therefore use much less memory and are also significantly faster when generating their mesh. They make it possible to run way larger view distances, but they come with one significant drawback. When they are right next to a normal chunk, there is bound to be a gap. The idea would be to either have another type of chunk between the low resolution ones and the normal ones, or adjust the mesh generating algorithm so it can somehow handle that situation. I, however, never got around to do that, because then, after almost a year of development, it kind of faded out. That little bit of productivity left, it slowly shrank to nothing. I became more and more frustrated with all the old bad code, all the fundamental mistakes bound to stay in the project forever, and I even got really annoyed with Unity itself here and there. It almost made sense to throw it all away and start from the ground up in a completely different engine. But that would be crazy, I wouldn't do that. Right? Right?